Okay, let's get started. We are approaching the end of the semester. Only 2 weeks left. Hard to imagine, huh? Okay, we're working our way through the last part of this course. As I've been saying throughout, lots of different approaches to robotics. In evolutionary robotics, we're obviously applying a simulation of evolution. One of the main distinguishing features between evolution and learning methods is that evolution tends to tinker with both body and brain together. By definition, learning is something that is modifying neural structure over time. So in the last part of the course here, we're really focusing on a number of evolutionary robotics experiments that try and demonstrate the advantage of evolution. So in lectures 24, which we're going to finish today, and lecture 25, we're looking at two different genotype to phenotype mappings where the reach of the genotype, if you like, is being broadened. So whatever is being encoded in the genotype, it is affecting not only the neural structure of the robot, but also the body itself. And in lecture 26, and also to some degree in lecture 27, we're going to switch and ask not only how do we go about evolving bodies and brains, but why would we do so? What's the advantage that we can obtain by allowing evolution to tinker with body and brain together? And as you can probably imagine, has a lot to do with what we've been talking about in terms of embodied cognition, right? You have a body, you use that body literally or figuratively to push against the world and observe how the world pushes back, right? Some of your thinking is sitting there passively and introspecting and cogitating, but a lot of thinking goes on by acting. So if we want robots to become increasingly intelligent, sophisticated, and complex, we're going to have to give them a body with which they can push against the world and observe how the world pushes back. But what form that body should take to make that interaction with the environment fruitful, we want to try and turn that task over to evolution. Okay, so that's the short answer to why evolve bodies along with brains, but we'll get to that in more detail in lecture 26. So before we finish up lecture 24, just back to the weekly reports. Hopefully you're making good progress now, and hopefully you've gotten into the rhythm where you're implementing a particular milestone and then thinking about how to explain it to a future student. So last night you submitted, hopefully you submitted, instructions for how to reach milestone 1. And again, the idea there is we're looking for middle ground, right? You're not giving the answer to the student by telling them where to plug in various code snippets, and you're not giving overly vague instructions. You're helping them to figure it out more or less on their own with a little bit of guidance. Okay, so now by next Monday, whatever your next milestone is, you're going to be implementing that and submitting either a set of static screenshots or a short video. It's up to you to demonstrate to us that you've successfully implemented your second milestone. And then the week after that, again, you'll describe it to future students. There's been a number of questions about changing the milestones. It's perfectly fine with us if at the end your set of milestones doesn't look anything like the ones that you originally submitted a few weeks back. That's fine. Again, what we're looking for is a long list of milestones which are leading up to something that's relatively ambitious. Again, some of you, milestone 1 or your milestone 2 might be, sort of trivial. If that's the case, enlarge your milestone so milestone 2 is about a week's worth of work. Okay. Any questions about the final project? So far, so good? Okay. All right, so back to lecture 24. We almost finished this lecture last time. We were looking at one of the very first papers in the field, and is still very much the high watermark for evolving bodies and brains. This was an incredibly ambitious project that was carried out in 1994, at that time on the state-of-the-art iron that was out there, which was the Connection Machine 5. Which was a supercomputer back in 1994, and now it's basically equivalent to your MacBook Pro if you have one. We looked at the genotype to phenotype mapping in a fair bit of detail last time. The genotypes are now graphs. So we've looked at lots of different genotypes. We've looked at genetic algorithms or hill climbers in which the genotype is a vector or matrix of numbers. We looked at another evolutionary algorithm where genotypes were encoded as trees. Which evolutionary algorithm was that? Different evolutionary algorithms encode genotypes in different data structures. Genetic something. Genetic programming. It's called genetic programming because when genetic programming was invented, also around this time in the early 1990s, the trees were encoding computer programs. So instead of evolving robots or evolving neural networks, could you evolve a computer program to do something? And one good straight data structure for encoding a computer program that can be mutated, crossed, and so on is to encode it as a tree, right? So we looked at trees. In this case, Sims chose to encode his genotypes as graphs, where each node in the graph encoded instructions for building a body part in the physics engine, and each edge in the genotype had information about how the new body part that's being built, how it should be built relative to the original body part to which it's attached, right? Things could be moved, translated, orientation could be changed, the objects could be scaled, and so on. These genotypes had a recursive property to them, so they could be visited many times, and that recursion could be halted with this recursion limit. And as we saw with the phenotypes, if you have this recursive genotype to phenotype mapping, you bias evolution towards certain kinds of body plans. If you create a random genotype over here, you connect together some nodes, you often get, you might not get a humanoid body plan, but you definitely get a non-random body plan. You create a random genotype, and most of the phenotypes that are produced from these randomly generated genotypes have familiar structure in them. They have repetition, they have symmetry, they have hierarchy. So maybe you have 3 parts making up the body plan, and each part in turn is made up of hierarchical parts, and so on. And you also get fractal structure. When we switch to the next lecture, we're going to look at a different genotype to phenotype mapping, which really biases search towards fractal genotypes. You see symmetry and hierarchy and fractal structure in biological systems in plants and animals because those properties tend to be useful if you want to get around in the world. What's the advantage of symmetry for animals? We talked about this briefly last time. What's the problem if you're asymmetric?
With symmetry, you basically have to learn how to move only one side, and you can mirror it to the other side.
Exactly, right? It's relatively easy to move in a straight line. If you're asymmetric, it's pretty hard to do so, right? The different sides of your body are going to have to do different things. What's the advantage of fractal structures?
Increasing surface area.
Increasing surface area, so most plants are fractal mostly for that reason. There's fractal structures in us as well. What's the advantage for animals? Your vascular system that circulates blood through the body, your nervous system which circulates sensory and motor information throughout the building, tends to follow a branching and fractal structure. Why? You have an idea?
Is it because there's like a varying degree of sizes of fractal structure?
There is a varying degree of sizes, right? So things near the root tend to be very large and transport a lot of flow if we're talking about blood, or a lot of information if we're talking about your spinal cord. And then small capillaries or small pipes towards the periphery. Why? What's the advantage of that? You could transport blood or electricity or information through the body using non-fractal structures. You could have networks of flow that are not fractal.
Is it like more redundant? So like if you just have one big artery supplying blood and that gets damaged, then you just don't get blood to that body part?
Absolutely, right? So one aspect of it is you don't want to have just one long pipe snaking all the way through the body, because if something happens to that pipe, you're in trouble. Right? One of the other nice things about fractal or branching structures is if you need to supply a lot of blood or information over a wide area, you can do it with a minimum of piping using a fractal structure. Right? It's very efficient to do so. Okay, so again, we could look at plants and animals and argue for why symmetry and hierarchy and fractal structure are useful. We can see here that Sims has created a particular genotype to phenotype mapping that biases search towards those kind of structures. It doesn't bias search towards any particular kind of symmetry or body plan, just it increases the chances that those desirable properties are going to show up in the things that you want to evolve. Okay, so we looked at a bunch of actually evolved virtual creatures last time. We looked at how this genotype on the left is not just a graph, but a nested graph. So there are smaller graphs, or there are nodes and edges that are embedded or nested inside each individual node of the top level graph. And that's a way of allowing evolution to embed local neural circuits. So this circuit shows up here and here and here and here. It allows evolution to evolve local neural circuits and pattern them or copy them throughout the body. And by adding an additional node to the genotype here, evolution could also create some neural structure that only appears once in the body, which is the central brain, if you have a fitness function that requires central neural control. Okay. We looked at how Sims implemented crossover and grafting. We looked at the final fitness function that Sims devised for his creatures, which was to have a pair of creatures compete over a common resource, this cube. We looked at the fitness function last time. So for robot 1 wants to minimize its distance to the cube, d1, and maximize its opponent's distance from the cube, which is d2, and vice versa for robot 2. Okay. So if we have a population of these robots and we're trying to determine the fitness of pairs of robots, which two robots do we pull out of the population and compete against one another? Turns out this is a little bit tricky, because in A here, if you have every robot in the population compete against every other robot, so you take one robot, competes against all other n-1 robots, we could take our fitness function here, compute how well robot 1 does against all n-1 using this fitness function, and then take the average of all of those n-1 values, and that would tell us generally how good robot 1 is, at least when it competes against its n-1 peers. The problem with that, of course, is that it's very computationally costly, right? So it's going to take n squared minus n divided by 2 simulations for a population of n robots. Right? Especially back in 1994, this was a pretty expensive prospect. So could we do something better? Well, we could certainly do something that is not as computationally costly by just picking robots at random and pairing them up. But of course, that's not a very fair way of doing things, right? You could team up the best robot against the second best robot in the population, unbeknownst to you, and the second best robot in the population, which loses, looks no better than the second worst robot in the population that got teamed, or the worst robot in the population that got teamed up against the second worst robot in the population. right? So you could take a page out of the NBA handbook here and do March Madness, but as you know, that also still has this problem that it's unfair to teams depending on who they get paired up with at the outset. So what Sims finally came up with is a strategy which he referred to as all versus best. And this works as follows. In the first generation, you have no idea about the relative performance of any robots in the population, so you do all versus all. And some of those robots survive into the next population. Those that don't do such a good job die off. And in the next generation, you take all of the new robots, and they only compete against the best robot, which gives you n-1, at most n-1 competitions. Why is that a good way to do things? Why is that fair, more fair? So you have the best robot from the last population, from the last generation, and you're competing all the new robots against the best one in the population.
Because of the way the infrastructure works, I guess this kind of makes it a standard. So how will you do in comparison to the best robot? Is how you would do, I guess, probably comparison to other robots as well.
It's a better estimate, right? Because everyone's being competed against the same robot, and this one has already been vetted. It's usually pretty good. It did well against lots of other robots, at least in the previous population. So if one of these robots can do better than this robot, you've got a pretty good estimate that this robot really is pretty good. If it can outcompete this one, it can probably, although you're not quite sure, also beat all of the robots that this robot beat in the previous generation. Not perfectly, but possibly. Okay, so if one of these robots does better than the best in the population, obviously it's the best, and at the next generation, all robots will be competed against that robot, and you can bring down the computational cost of each generation from n squared to about n, right? Not bad. Okay, Sims also tried taking the population and breaking it into two populations or two species. So you've got Team A and Team B, and individuals from Team A only ever compete against robots in Team B, and vice versa. So you could do, again, all versus all. It's not quite n squared minus n divided by 2, but it's still pretty bad, still pretty computationally costly. So you could do the same thing like before, pick a random member from A and a random member from B and compete them against one another, but again, it's still unfair. So you could also do this all versus best idea here, which is every member of Team A is competed against the best member of Team B from the previous generation, and vice versa. So Sims actually tried all 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of these methods, and these two methods at the end of the evolutionary run tended to produce better robots, in the sense that if you took the best robots at the end of these two experiments and competed them against the robots at the end of these experiments, these robots tended to do better. Plus, it took you less time to evolve such superior robots. So just an interesting result from looking at this issue of selection. We've spent a lot of time talking about genotype to phenotype maps and mutation and crossover. What happens when we want to try and estimate the quality of a given robot, where it's hard to estimate the quality of the robot on its own, right? Really, the quality of any robot is going to be how it does compared to other robots, or how it does in natural surroundings when it's interacting with lots of other robots and people and so forth, right? Things can become pretty costly pretty quickly because you get into combinations and permutations, right? What are all the situations in which this robot might find itself? So this is an interesting paper also from that point of view that looked at trying to estimate the fitness of a robot in a computationally efficient manner. There are some interesting visualizations from the paper showing what happens when you have these two species over time. So these are four different evolutionary runs. So we have evolutionary time on the horizontal axis. Gray line represents the average fitness of Team A, and the black line represents the average fitness of Team B. What happened in the first evolutionary run up here?
Kind of changed who was better a couple times.
Right, so there's a little bit of a dance going on here, right? Members of Team A are competing against members of Team B and vice versa. For a while, Team A or Team Black is doing a little bit better than Team Gray, and then because of chance mutation and crossover, members of Team Gray on average become a little bit better than members of Team B. Start the run all over again, start with a different random set of two populations, and you get two very different dynamics. What happened here?
So Team Gray was just always worse.
So why? Why is that possible? Why did you not get the dynamics you see in the other
The
two?
best of Team Gray was always worse than the best of Team Black. So you didn't really get any kind of like back and forth.
Right, no back and forth there. If you go back and watch the Sims video, there's one of these bigger creatures that reaches past the block and just presses down on the robot on the other side and just holds it in place, right? Literally dominating the other robot there. This is interesting because now we get into not evolution but coevolution, right, or ecology. You look at species of plants and animals competing for common resources over time. You get all sorts of interesting dynamics that go on. If you build these coevolutionary dynamics into your evolutionary simulation, sometimes you get interesting back and forths between the two species. In this case, the gradient has collapsed. So what do we mean by the gradient has collapsed? Well, at some point here during these few generations, some members in Team Black evolved some strategy that just dominated all members of Team Gray. So now when you're trying to compute the fitness of the individuals in Team Gray, they're all getting a fitness of 0 because all members of Team Gray are being competed against the best member of Team Black, right? So if all of them are getting a fitness of 0, evolution basically grinds to a halt within the gray population, right? Any mutation or crossover, if you have an entire population and all individuals have a fitness of 0, which ones do you kill off and which ones do you make randomly modified copies of? Sort of now it's just basically by chance, right?
Would we then compete the best of Team Black against the other another copy of the best of Team Black, or introduce new species?
You could, right? So you could reach in at this point and sort of pause the game and say, okay, let's try and do something different, right? So because once you've lost that gradient, evolution is not doing anything anymore in Team Gray, right? Everyone has a fitness of 0. There might actually be a few individuals in Team Gray that are starting to evolve the ability to wriggle out from underneath the hand of the member of Team Black, but maybe they haven't wriggled out all the way. They're still getting a fitness of 0, right? So those might die off because they look, from the fitness point of view, just as bad as anything else, right? Very difficult for evolution to get started again. So coevolution, or breaking your population into multiple populations, can help because fitness pressure from the other population is pushing or spurring innovation in the other population, but if it pushes too hard, you lose evolutionary pressure altogether, right? In this fourth case here, you can see there's some really interesting things going on. What do these big amplitude jumps mean? You can see it a little bit in the first 2 runs, but in the fourth run, it's really very high amplitude back and forth. What does that mean? What's going on here?
Could it be that they both developed strategies that, because they're like a little more complex, you can't just immediately determine how well it'll do based on the neural network or based on the morphology of the thing. Like, you know, based on the physics simulation, there's a possibility that the one who just grabs it,
Right.
won't grab it quite right, and then the other one might grab it as well. So
It-
it's
it-
kind of a toss-up.
Yeah, it could be, right? Remember somewhere in the video, they're both sort of hitting it back and forth like a hockey puck between two sticks, right? That might be what's going on. They might have a good strategy, but it's brittle, right? It works pretty well against this individual, but a slightly different individual, and now you're doing much worse compared to that individual, right? A lot of back and forth going on in the dynamics between these two populations. Okay, so an amazing paper, as I mentioned, still one of the high water marks in the literature. A lot of things going on in this paper. This was an amazing result, especially for 22 years ago. One of the things I want you to take away from this as we transition into the next lecture is this genotype to phenotype map, which again biased search or biased evolution towards certain kinds of body plans. So let's fast forward now a few years to 2001, and we're going to look in lecture 25 now at a different genotype to phenotype mapping, which is also going to be used to evolve bodies and brains of robots. And this particular genotype to phenotype mapping is going to bias, again, evolution towards body plans or robots that have certain desirable properties. Before we get to that genotype to phenotype mapping, we're going to go back again in time a little bit here and do a little bit of computer science history. Anybody program in Logo? Anybody remember Logo? A few people, okay. One of the first programming languages devised back in the 1960s. It was devised to be an educational language to help young people start to code. The most famous aspect of Logo was its turtle graphics, or the turtle him or herself. The idea behind turtle graphics is one of the things that's difficult for most people when they start to learn how to code is it's pretty abstract. You write a piece of code and you run it. Maybe it prints something to the screen, maybe it doesn't. It's kind of hard to visualize or understand what the program is doing when it executes the code that you wrote. So turtle graphics was an attempt to try and visualize anything that you write in Logo, and when you run that program, the program is visualized by graphics, right? So basic idea is you have a turtle. The turtle can move over a two-dimensional surface. It's a pretty simple turtle. It has three aspects of state. It has a particular position, the turtle has a particular orientation, and the turtle has a pen, which the turtle can either put down and draw with as it moves or lift up, so that when it moves, it does not draw, right? So here would be some code, quote unquote, that you might write for the turtle. Move forward 10 paces, turn left 95 degrees, drop the pen, move forward, lift the pen, and so on. Turns out that those 5 lines of code do not draw this picture that you see on the left. If you have the slides in front of you, don't cheat by looking at the code on the next slide. What would be some code that would produce this picture? Let's say we drop the turtle right here. Write some code for me that will produce this spiral.
So it's a series of large squares. So all we need to do is start either at the middle or at the end and make it draw a large square. Then turn it just a tiny little bit in orientation and draw another one.
Okay.
etc.
So again, this is the key to writing code. It's a good start, right? But we need to be pretty specific. Is that going to do it?
We're going to be incrementing, or I guess the move forward code piece that then increases over time, or like increases with each turn statement.
Exactly, right? So going back to Slayton's idea, if we start here and draw a large square and then turn and draw another large square, you would get this, right? So part of part of the genius of logo was if you're not sufficiently specific about what you ask for, you'll immediately see what you need to refine in your thinking, right? So if this is what you're trying to draw and you get this, that might lead you to the innovation like, oh, that's right, I have to draw a slightly larger square each time I draw four lines. Okay, so start in the middle, drop the pen. We're going to ask the turtle to do 1,000 things. It's going to move forward by 1 unit of distance plus I divided by 1,000, right? We're going to use the variable in our for loop to dictate the size of the square. So all the concepts that you learned in Programming 101 about loops and iteration, variables, recursion, all those sorts of things can be visualized by the turtle by challenging your students to think about, here's a picture, what would be the code that would produce that picture, right? I could also write a program that has 10,000 lines of code that manually specifies how to draw this picture, right? What's the fewest lines of code that will produce a given visualization?
Do we have a visualization for recursion?
For
Recursion.
absolutely we do, and I'm going to show it to you in 2 slides from now.
Cool.
Okay. Right, and again, often if you show this picture and ask beginning programmers to do it, they'll forget that the turtle should not quite turn at 90 degrees, it should be 85 degrees, and go from there, right? So you're starting to help the students understand you got to be very specific and refine your intuition as you go. Yes?
That's good. I feel like moving forward one step and then like a fraction of a step is not going to get you ever bigger than just like that original small piece.
So you're moving forward by 1 plus 1.00001, then moving forward by 1.0002. It's a very slight increase, right? Each line is slightly larger than the next one.
Yes, but
Is it big enough?
I feel like it's not big enough because like if you're doing like one full step and then a little more, and then one full step and then just a little more, it looks like the steps are almost doubling in size, or like
Good catch.
the length of each.
Good catch. All right. If anyone has logo embedded in their web page, try and put this in and see. I bet you're right. There's probably a bug in my code too, right? Okay, good catch. The rate at which the length increments, that rate should probably be non-constant. I think you're right. Good catch. Okay. Not trivial, right? Simple turtle, just a pen. Not so easy. Okay. Let's set aside turtle graphics for a moment. Let's revisit another aspect of computer science, which is formal grammars. Some of you might have thought you'd never see formal grammars again. Not so fast. Okay, what's a formal grammar? We start by defining an alphabet, uppercase V, that contains a number of variables. Each variable we might represent with lowercase v. We're going to start with a starting sentence that's composed of a few elements from B. So let's take variable A and variable B, put them together. That's our starting sentence. We're then going to write down a set of production rules. Here are 2 production rules. Each production rule is made up of a predecessor and a successor. The predecessor must have a reference to a variable. And the successor then says if you find this variable in a string, erase that variable and replace it with this phrase or this sub-sentence or this collection of variables and constants. If you find this variable in the string, replace it with this, right? You can have an arbitrary number of these production rules and arbitrary variables on in the predecessor and the successor. We can further refine our definitions. We can define not just variables, but constants. And constants, as you would imagine, they don't show up in the successor. Once a constant is written into the sentence, that constant is not going to change if you reapply the production rules to the current sentence, right? Take the production rules and apply it to the starting sentence. So some of the variables will be replaced and erased and replaced with other things, which will give you back a new sentence. You can apply the production rules again, which will give you a third sentence, and you can continue ad infinitum, or you can apply the rules until the sentence no longer contains any variables, or you can apply the production rules for a fixed length of time. Is this sounding familiar to some of you? Okay. Here's an example that I just pulled off of Wikipedia. One of the interesting things about formal grammars is they're of interest not just to computer scientists. It turns out that with a relatively simple, a simple set of variables, a simple start sentence, and even a few simple rules, you can start to get dynamics that look very much like things that happen in nature. Back in the 1970s, a biologist named Lindenmayer came up with this very, very simple formal grammar that actually seemed to describe quite well the exponential increase in populations of simple organisms like algae. And he did that by defining two variables, A and B. A stands for algae, or the adult form of the algae, and B stands for bud, or the larval form of the algae. So production rule A gives rise to AB as a model of growth. We have an adult algae, and it buds off from one side, a bud, B. The bud, after a period of time, matures into an adult algae, which in turn is capable of reproduction. So if we start with our starting sentence here, which is a single instance or a single algae organism, from one time step to the next, if our time steps are in days, after 1 day, this algae has produced a bud. At the next time step, B has matured into A, and A has again produced, AB has produced a second bud. So here's the new child. The older child has now matured into an adult, which itself produces a bud at the next time step, and so on and so forth. And you can see we get very easily exponential growth. Now, of course, algae actually do much more complicated things than that, but this was pretty surprising back in the 1970s that such a very simple algorithm or recipe could produce a relatively accurate model of what a biological organism will do, assuming that it's given infinite resources and so on. Okay, so back to Slayton's question about recursion here. Can we actually get recursive or fractal structures? Actually, there isn't recursion in this one. It'll be in I think, the next one. I just mentioned Lindenmayer, who was this biologist who realized that these things called formal grammars from computer science could actually be imported into biology and used to model organisms. Lindenmayer put formal grammars together with turtle graphics from logos so that you could visualize the result of applying production rules. And he realized that you can do some interesting things if you do so. One of the first things he realized is that you can very quickly get not just things like exponential growth, which you see in nature, but you can also get fractal structures. Again, something that is pretty ubiquitous in nature. So a very simple fractal here is known as Cantor dust. So Cantor dust, once you iterate the fractal enough, and if you look along a one-dimensional line, it looks like a sprinkling of dust that has this fractal nature. You take one long line, you cut out the middle third, which gives you 2 lines. You go and take each of those 2 lines, cut out the middle third, rinse and repeat for long enough, and you get Cantor dust. Here's a formal grammar. Again, 2 variables, no constants. We'll start with A, and whenever we see A, we'll replace it with ABA. Whenever we see B, we'll replace it with BBB. And in a Lindenmayer system, you now associate with each variable an action that the turtle can perform. So now, an A means drop the pen and move forward, and B means lift up the pen and move forward. Right? So if we take our starting character string and give it to the turtle, we'll get this. If we take our starting sentence and apply the production rules once, we get this. If we give this sentence to the turtle, it'll give us this. If we apply the production rules again, we get this and this and this and so on. Yeah? Okay, so that's a Lindenmayer system, which is combine formal grammars with turtle graphics so that we can visualize the results of running a formal grammar. Lindenmayer was actually not so much interested in algae and Cantor dust. He was more interested in the fractal nature of plants. And he wrote, as you can imagine, he wrote a book on this, or published a book on this that was mostly pictures, not so much text. It's amazing that with a relatively simple formal grammar, here's another one, you can get visualization. So here's the results of some turtle graphics that look pretty familiar, right? It's amazing how lifelike some of these visualizations can be. Lindenmayer and his successors have come up with formal grammars that produce oaks, elms, particular kinds of flowers, actual species from nature. Of course, that does not mean that nature is running a formal grammar, but whatever is going on in nature has something in common, it would seem, with these formal grammars. Okay, so here's the formal grammar that produces this picture on the right. Now we get into the recursion part of this. Here's our starting string here, x. Whenever we see x, we're going to replace x with this long thing here. Whenever we see f, replace it with two f's. F means draw forward, minus means, so F means draw forward, F means turtle turn 25 degrees to the left, plus means turtle turn 25 degrees to the right, X is just an empty placeholder. Now we introduce two more variables or two more elements to our alphabet, push and pop. So the turtle moves forward, turns 25 degrees to the left, and now pushes the current state of the turtle, which is that the turtle's position is here, it's turned 25 degrees to its left, and the pen is down. It goes off and does this whole thing, and eventually the turtle is reading the string left to right, hits the pop position, and pops off the top of the stack its previous state. So it teleports back to this position, and now somewhere here turns 25 degrees back to its right, carries on, draws this branch, and so on. Right? So now we've got some recursion in there, and we can get some really fractal structures. So far, so good? Okay, so again, we've been talking about formal grammars and Cantor dust and plants and so on. Where's the robots? Here are the robots. We're now going to take a Lindenmayer system, which combines a formal grammar and turtle graphics, and use it instead of, we're now going to task the turtle not with drawing Cantor dust or drawing plants, but now the turtle is going to draw a robot directly into a simulator for us. So far, so good? Okay, so here are all the variables that are going to make up our formal grammar for drawing robots. We have our square brackets, which are going to represent push and pop, so we're going to have recursion in our formal grammar. Curly brackets followed by an integer is going to tell the turtle, do whatever commands are inside the curly braces or inside the curly braces, and repeat that set of actions n times. Forward, turtle moves forward and draws a cylinder into the physics engine. Backward is the turtle moves backwards along the cylinder that it just created. Revolute 1, so revolute is just another name for a hinge joint, so revolve a joint around a particular axis. So now the turtle moves forward, and when it adds a new cylinder, because it's moving forward, attach the new cylinder to the cylinder that you just came from, and attach those two cylinders together with a revolute joint, and that joint should rotate around the z-axis, right? So depending on what the axes are in this physics engine, it's either this or this. Revolute 2, do the same thing, but now just add a joint with the joint normal, a different joint normal. Yeah. Remember that our turtle has a particular position, so it's sitting somewhere on the robot that it's making, and that turtle can change its orientation. So up means it rotates its heading, so now it's pointing up. And now if it goes forward, it's going to create a vertical cylinder. It might rotate itself downwards by 90 degrees, turn left or right, turn clockwise or counterclockwise, right? Remember, the turtle now is not in a two-dimensional plane. It's in a three-dimensional space, so it can turn left or right, up or down, or twist clockwise or counterclockwise.
The revolute thing again?
Yes.
Does it move forward? Does it leave a joint behind and move forward, or?
Yes. So we can, let's say that the turtle is sitting here, so it's just created a cylinder, and it's sitting here. It might receive the command create bar forward. Create bar forward, the turtle will move 1 unit of distance forward and drop a bar here. And these will be welded together. So this is, you can actually think of it as creating a fixed joint. Alternatively, if the turtle is sitting here and receives the command revolute 1, it will also move forward, create a bar, and it will create a joint here that revolves around the z-axis or the y-axis. Make sense? Okay. I'm sorry, I think this might have been missing from your slides. N here, the joint commands to the turtle is also parameterized by an integer n, which is the rate of oscillation of the motor. So whenever a revolute joint is created, it's also defined to be a motorized joint, and it's outputting a certain oscillation. But that oscillation can be modulated by the neural network, which we haven't talked about yet. So far, we've just talked about the turtle creating the body. So we have a turtle that is moving through three-dimensional space, and as it's moving through three-dimensional space, it can add additional structure to the robot body. The turtle also, while it's creating the body, is also creating a neural network inside the body. And in the paper, they describe the turtle as simultaneously living at a particular position in three-dimensional space in the simulation, and also living or sitting on an individual synapse in the growing neural network, which I don't know about you, but that's hard for me to wrap my mind around. The easier way to think about this is to think about two turtles, the body turtle and the brain turtle. Both turtles are reading one long sentence, which is commands to the turtles. Some of those commands are meant for the body turtle, which it listens to, and some of the other commands are heard by the brain turtle, and it responds appropriately.
In the network, is the turtle limited spatially? So can it only make a new neuron budding off of its current synapse, or?
Yes,
Okay.
exactly, right? So locality is very important for
Otherwise,
turtle.
there wouldn't be any
point to have a turtle, right?
Yeah.
You could just say draw or create anything. The point of the turtle is to help you have an intuition for how structure is created, right? We had the turtle that was creating the spiral or the Cantor dust, right? You need to be able, the creators of the logo language wanted you to be able to put yourself in the shoes of the turtle, and as you're writing code, imagine what the turtle would do in response to that code, right? That's the idea. So locality is very, very important. So for the body turtle, it is sitting at a particular point in space. So if it executes any of those commands are going to be instantiated at that physical location in the physics engine. Sorry. The brain turtle is sitting on a single synapse. So in all of these neural networks that you see here, there's always one synapse that's in bold. That's where the turtle is sitting at that point in time. So far, so good? Okay. So what commands does the brain turtle respond to? Well, the turtle also responds to open square bracket and close square bracket. And the only state that exists for the brain turtle is what synapse am I sitting on at the current time. So if in reading a string of commands to the turtle, it gets open square bracket, it will record the current synapse that it's sitting on. And if it then executes a subsequent number of build commands that grow the neural network, when it hits the pop command, it will teleport back and sit on the synapse that it was sitting on before. Yeah? Okay. If it hits decrease weight, it will decrease the weight of the synapse to which it's sitting on. I don't see any increase weight. There should be an increase weight. Perhaps n here can be positive or negative. Duplicate. So take the current synapse that you're sitting on. I don't see any here. Oh yeah, here we go. So take the synapse that you're sitting on and create a second synapse that connects A to B. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention, we're going to refer to neuron A and neuron B. So from the point of view of the turtle, which is sitting on a synapse, neuron A is at the base of the synapse that you're sitting on, and neuron B is at the head of the synapse that you're sitting on. So for this turtle that's sitting here, neuron A is this neuron, and neuron B is this neuron. For the turtle that's sitting on this synapse, this is neuron A, and this is neuron B. I apologize, the lettering here makes that a little bit confusing. A is the source neuron, B is the target neuron. Okay. So duplicate, create a second synapse, loop, create a new link from B to itself with weight n. So if I'm a turtle sitting here, I look at neuron B, which is ahead of me, and I add a new self synapse that connects neuron B to itself, but I remain sitting on the synapse that I'm sitting on. Merge, so merge my source neuron and my target neuron into one new neuron called C, and the new link that I'm sitting on is the nth input link to C. So I'm sitting on a synapse that connects neuron A to neuron B. I merge those together, and I may jump from the current synapse that I'm sitting on, which is now a self synapse, right? It connects neuron C to itself, to some other neuron, right? Because there may be multiple synapses that connect a neuron to itself. Parent N, move to the nth input link to A. So if I'm sitting on a synapse, neuron A is behind me, I back up to neuron A, and then there are a number of synapses that are arriving at A. So there are a number of links that are inputting to A, and I can't sit on A, I can't sit on a neuron, I have to sit on a synapse, so I jump another step back onto the nth input link to A, and that's dictated by the integer n here, right? Next means I'm going to jump next, or I'm going to jump forward in the flow of the network. I'm pointing at B, so I move forward to neuron B, and then I also take another step forward, and now I sit on the nth outgoing synapse from neuron B, right? So I'm hitting these, I'm hopping forward or backwards through the network. Reverse, I take the synapse that I'm sitting on and I reverse it. The head of the neuron now points to B, and the tail of the synapse now points at B, and the head of the synapse now points to A. I reverse the direction of the synapse. Output N, so I'm sitting on a synapse. I look at neuron A that's behind me, and I talk to my buddy, which is the body turtle, and I say, hey, body turtle, wherever you're sitting, take the output from the neuron behind me, neuron A, and use that to modulate the frequency of the motorized joint that's closest to you. Remember that whenever the body turtle is creating a rotational joint, it's setting the rate of oscillation, but that rate of oscillation may be changed by values arriving from the neural network. So the two turtles can talk to one another. Finally, split, which is the inverse of merge. So I'm sitting on a synapse that connects A to B, create a new neuron C, which as you can imagine is going to now lie between neuron A and B. Attach a synapse that now goes from A to C, and I'm going to sit on that one. And I'm then going to create a new edge that goes from C to B, and that new synapse should have a weight of n. Okay, turn to your neighbor. Imagine this is the starting neural network. Which command did the turtle execute to turn this into this? What command did the turtle then execute to turn this into this? And see how many of these you can figure out. Make sense? Okay, give you a couple minutes and let's see what you come up with.
Wait a second. No. We create B, but then I can add new synapse. Yeah, I don't know. I guess you're right. That was you start off to create it. Oh, Professor Bongard?
Yes.
For duplicate, what direction is it initially? Is it from?
So the brain turtle is sitting on a synapse that connects A to B. You're adding a new synapse that connects A to B also.
Right, but is it in the same direction as the original synapse?
It is because it says from A to B. That tells you what the direction is.
Okay, right.
That's all right. Not from B to A, right? From A to B.
So then we just have to add a reverse.
Yeah, east and west. You have the edge D going to C, and you have
Yeah, because it says, so split goes attached edge A to C. So it is doing that from split, but create a new edge from C to B. Yeah, because you actually gain two edges. I guess that would be.
Decrease weight also happens.
There may be more than one command that's executed from one panel to the next.
So I don't think so it uses it creates a new edge, right? So there's
Yeah, because it goes to the other one.
So it duplicates.
but we do have to reverse.
It duplicates the B to A. It duplicates the A to B. But both of those go. One goes to C, one goes from C to B. And then there's a new edge over this. What's it?
Yeah, because that one goes to C.
Yeah, that one goes to C.
Yeah, because it goes attached edge from C. Then there's a third one, that's why.
So it's a split.
Yeah.
All right, shall we give this a try? How do we get from panel A to panel B? One command.
We have to use split at least once because that's the only command that creates a new neuron.
So split, I'll just write S for split, and remember that split takes a number, right? Where's split here?
So
Create a new neuron C.
So let's say our number is 0.8. So that the secondary, the new synapse that we make is going to be at 0.8, so we don't have to do a decrease or anything.
That makes sense, right? So here, obviously, this neuron is both neuron A and B. So create a new neuron C, attach an edge from A to C. Is that right? No, wait. Yes, split. Create a new, attach edge from A to C, and create a new edge from C to B with weight 0.8. And it's not explicitly mentioned here, but you can now infer from this that when the turtle creates that new edge from C to B, it jumps onto that new edge, right? So the turtle is now sitting on the new synapse with weight 0.8. Okay, what's the next command? Duplicate. So it's sitting here. So it duplicates. We create another edge. So I'll just write D. And then what?
D with 3 and then.
Create a new edge, and we need a number here.
So 3.
Then, and reverse probably doesn't take a command, right? Okay, so far so good. Next one. Right, that went from C to D, D to E. You've got a new neuron, so split first. What's the number that goes in here?
Looks like it's a 2.
Wait,
No,
I think
wait,
one
wait,
A
wait,
would
yeah.
go from D to B.
So it's sitting here. So we can see the original 0.25 and 0.8 here, right? So that's here. Now I've confused myself.
But if we use split, then we're making a new synapse between C and A in addition to 3. So
Is it split first?
no, that's the job.
Okay, I'll leave it as an exercise to the reader. Not so easy to see. Probably something else it does before split. But you get the idea, right? If this is the sentence that's produced by the formal grammar, and you start by giving the two turtles this to start with for the body, and this as the brain to start with, as the brain turtle starts to read along the string and it recognizes commands that are specific for it, it will start to elaborate this embryonic neural network into a more complex neural network over time. Okay. So as I mentioned, there's two turtles here, and these two turtles are actually working together, which is nice because at the end you're going to have one long string, and peppered inside that string are commands for elaborating the body and elaborating the brain. But from the point of view of the formal grammar, it doesn't matter. It's all just variables, right? So we have one genotype, which is the formal grammar now, right? And that formal grammar is sort of mixing up body and brain together. Okay. If for the body turtle, if it executes the joint command, so create a motorized joint, it also gets a command from the turtle. So in essence, the body turtle is sending output 1 to the brain turtle. It says, hey, look, I just created a joint. I need an incoming synapse to modulate the frequency of the motor at that joint. So as the body is growing, the neural network is being connected to it. And which part of the neural network is connected to it is dependent on where the brain turtle is sitting, right? The brain turtle is sitting somewhere in the growing brain and says, you need a connection here, take the one from the base of the synapse that I'm sitting on, my neuron A. Okay. I added a couple slides here last night, so if these aren't in the copy that you have, make sure to re-download it from Blackboard. This is just a screenshot from one part of the paper here that I thought was particularly interesting. What they actually did in this paper was to use a parametric formal grammar, or since we're applying it to turtle graphics, a parametric LSystem. Have people seen parameterized formal grammars before? We now have, as the name implies, parameters on the successor side of the production rules and conditional statements. So now, as we're executing the formal grammar and we're reading through a string and we encounter the variable a, we might also encounter, associated with a parameter. So in a parameterized formal grammar, you start with a starting sentence,
and the variables in that starting sentence start with initial parameters, which in this case is 4. So n equals 4 when we encounter A, 4 is greater than 1, so we replace A with this successor substring. If A happens to be less than or equal to 1, down here, if we encounter this A, we replace it with a different successor state. So now, in a parameterized formal grammar, every production rule has one successor, an, but can have one or more, it has just one predecessor and can have one or more successors. And whichever successor is used is dependent on the value of the parameter. Why do you think the authors in this case used a parameterized Lindenmayer system? What might be the advantage of the parameterized Lindenmayer system for building robots over a non-parameterized one?
Just to have conditionals? Conditionals.
So they have conditionals, but why is that useful?
It allows you to recurse so many times depending on what you give n, and it kind of has a base case where it stops the recursion.
Exactly, right? So it's a little bit more of recursion here. You can think about this, again, depending on how your production rules are set up, but you can constrain them so every production rule has a base case, and if the parameter is decreasing, if you're replacing a particular variable with the same variable and decreasing the value of the parameter, you're instantiating recursion. Now it turns out that you can create different production rules, different parameterized production rules that do not instantiate recursion, but one thing you can do with them is instantiate recursion. And recursion is useful for robotics because, remember back to the previous lecture on Carl Sims, right? He had his genotype, which was a graph, and there were those recursion limits in his genotype to phenotype mapping. What did that produce? What did the recursion in his genotype produce in the phenotype? Symmetry, hierarchy, fractal structures, all that sort of thing, right? So again, Hornby and his colleagues here are trying to bias evolution towards genotypes that tend to produce desirable properties in your phenotype like fractalness, symmetry, and hierarchy.
So is recursion, like, can we really make a recursive neural net though? Like,
the neural network itself is not
it's
recursive,
not, but,
right?
Like, I'm just thinking about how we could apply recursion to other areas. Like,
Perhaps. Okay, so think about this now, right? So in this particular experiment here, the genotype is now a parameterized Lindenmayer system. Right? We've seen a lot of different experiments now where the genotype takes many different forms. So if this is the genotype, we have to think about how do you go about evolving such a thing. So if I asked you to build an evolutionary algorithm that evolves formal grammars, how would you do it? You have a population of individuals. Any one individual is a formal grammar. Any one genotype is a formal grammar. What are you going to have to build into that evolutionary algorithm to allow it to explore the space of all possible formal grammars? Not all possible, but to explore a large space of formal grammars. What kind of mutation operators are you going to have in here? Would you have crossover? What would you place under evolutionary control if you're evolving a parameterized formal grammar? The parameters, right? So these numbers here, which dictate what to do, depending on the value of the successor.
Also the operations that are done to them.
Exactly, right? So we can apply algebraic operations to the parameter values. What should we do when we see an instance of A with a parameter value of n? We're going to replace it with A and a new value of n.
Would we want to change things as much as like the actual operators, or just connect around with the like constants, like n divided by 4 rather than 2?
I don't know.
Because I feel like, switching a divide symbol with a multiply could just throw a wrench in whatever we're doing.
It's probably, if you were to do that, right? Let's say we always start with this starting string. This starting string is transformed eventually into this string with this set of production rules. If instead of dividing by 2, we multiply by 2, do you think this string, the new string, is going to look anything like the original string? It's going to be completely different, right? So we've got to be careful now, right? We definitely do not have a direct genotype to phenotype mapping. Any change to one part of the genotype is probably going to have a big impact on the phenotype. Here's a formal grammar that has 2 production rules in it. And for each of the 2 production rules, there are 2 possible successors. Does it have to be 2? What else could you mutate?
Well, we could have it so that if n is, modulus 2 equals 0, like if it's even or odd, or
So we could
yeah,
keep,
like
right,
let's say between 2 numbers.
yeah, we could change these operations, but what else about the formal grammar could evolution change?
The number of non-terminal symbols, I guess. So A or B, you could have B, D.
That's true, right? So we could increase the vocabulary, right? So you can think of all of the commands that are sent to the brain turtle and the body turtle as constants, right? But we could have variables, and variables have to eventually be rewritten with constants, right? Eventually we want to remove all of the variables from our string and have only constants left, so we could have more or less variables. What else could evolution change here? So let's think about our initial random population. We have a population of 200 formal grammars. Each formal grammar is made up of a number of production rules. Each production rule contains 1 or more successor states. So what should evolution be able to change? Aside from just what's inside the brackets of these parameters.
The number of successor states?
Of course, right? So maybe we have a mutation operator that adds a new successor state. So maybe we add a third one here, which is a third successor state if n is greater than 2. So now there may be 3 replacements of A depending on n rather than 2 possible replacements of A. If we have a mutation operator that adds a successor state to a production rule, we probably also want to have a mutation operator that can also delete a successor state. Add or remove successors to a production rule. Let's keep going.
Could we use object orientation and say A1, like the new A, could go into B just like A could?
Possibly, we could add that as well. What else? We have 2 production rules here for A and B. Oh, right, you mentioned adding variables. We could add additional production rules. We could add C and throw that in here. Or we could add in a new production rule, which is if you see A and B, replace it with something else. If you see A followed by B. Actually, if we do that, if we have 2 or more variables next to one another on the successor side, we have a new kind of formal grammar. Anybody remember what that is? It's not ambiguous. It's a context-sensitive grammar, which means now you're going to replace B depending on what's next to B. What is the context of B? What symbol is to the left of B? What symbol is to the right of B? So we could do all sorts of things, right? We could allow evolution to add and remove production rules, add and remove successor states, alter individual successors, right? Maybe a mutation operator is going to take this and add A n divided by 2. So now, whenever we see A, we're going to replace with A, B, and A, right? Evolution could play with the formal grammar, which is obviously going to produce different strings from a starting string. Okay. This was just an example, again, from the paper, which you can have a look through. So we've got our variables P on this side here, and eventually these are all rewritten with constants. And those constants are the commands to one of the two turtles. Okay, so of course saving this for the end, here are some of the evolved LSystem robots. What do you see in these robots? Symmetry, fractals, repetition. You see branching structures in here, all sorts of nice things. What do these robots do? Let's see if this will actually work. There we go. Okay. Wasn't a very sophisticated physics engine, but you get the idea.
It's like someone took the pipe wallpaper, not like the pipe screensaver from old Windows.
Oh yeah,
It's
exactly.
life.
It does. Good catch. Yeah, absolutely. They actually evolved a quadruped over here. Very nice. You've seen this mode of locomotion before. What is it? Peristalsis, right? Mother Nature. It's her favorite starting point for locomotion. Always, always. Okay, I think we will stop there for today. You have a quiz that's due tonight, and you are now implementing your second milestone for your final project. Thanks very much.